Now, in 1994 and 1998 to 2000, the Clinton administration engaged directly with North Korea, although Jimmy Carter had to intervene in 1994 to stop a war from happening. Clinton had approved a preemptive strike on the North Korean plutonium facility. But the North agreed to freeze that plutonium facility for 8 years. And in the last 2 years of that decade, there was a movement toward ending the armistice and getting a peace agreement, toward four-party talks between North and South Korea, the US, and China, which met a number of times. And above all, a deal on basically buying out North Korea's missiles. People have completely forgotten that. Madeleine Albright went to Pyongyang in November of 2000, and Bill Clinton was supposed to follow in December to sign this agreement in Pyongyang. But what everybody does remember is the 2000 election was the most absurd election in American history, where the Supreme Court gave the presidency to George W. Bush, who proceeded to demolish the Clinton Korea policy. Thanks to John Bolton in particular, they broke the 1994 agreement, so North Korea got back all its plutonium, and they refused to go forward with the missile agreement. Now, this is something that I said in the New York Review of Books a few years ago, and a very good scholar wrote in and said, "This is totally unfair to the Bush administration." I don't know how you can be any more unfair to the Bush administration than it deserves, because it not only prolonged the war in Korea and led to North Korea becoming a nuclear power, but it invaded Iraq, and that became a complete and utter disaster. So direct talks with the North at the highest level get things done. That's the history of the 1990s. Hasn't happened since. Barack Obama and George Biden. What was that, a Freudian slip? I don't actually include Joe Biden with George Bush in any sentence that I can think of. I think he's done a good job. But he hasn't done a good job, and neither has Obama or Trump or Biden, in constantly intimidating North Korea with nuclear bombers and refusing to talk directly to them. I mean, this is complete Orwellian double talk that the Biden administration is involved in. So we are ready to have unrestricted, unconditional talks with North Korea at any time about denuclearization. So we're completely stymied. North Korea is a nuclear power. It will always be a nuclear power. And that has to be put to the side so that other things can be accomplished, rather than trying to get them to give up something that none of us would give up. If you're intimidated by nuclear weapons for 70 or 80 years, Deterrence 101 tells you, guess what you need? Your own nuclear weapons. I don't want to excuse the North Koreans. They are author of most of their own problems. But it doesn't matter who would be governing in Pyongyang under this kind of threat. First thing they would want as soon as possible is a nuclear weapon. Now think about this. The U.S. sent 25,000 troops into South Korea in September 1945, September 9th. And 78 years later, we've got 28,000 still there. And war is still near. The intelligence director, Robert Gates, talked about how close we came to war with North Korea in 2010. And Leon Panetta, the defense secretary, told CNN that he had been within an inch of war for months with North Korea in 2012. To send troops in to block Kim Il-sung from taking over the peninsula, that's what the State Department thought. They thought there were thousands of guerrillas that were going to come in from Manchuria and take over Korea if we didn't send our troops in, which was not Roosevelt's policy, but it became Truman's policy. something that looked small, be there for a few months, bring the troops home. And now we have the grandson of Kim Il-sung with nuclear weapons and ICBMs. It's just a catastrophic policy failure. Chris Marker, you can see what he said there in his book. The book came out in French, and I took 2 years of French, but he's got a lot of abstruse sentences in it, and I never quite understood what was in his book. I could see the photos, but not the text. But in South Korea, his book on North Korea was translated in 1998, a beautiful edition with wonderful photos and in English. So I finally figured out what Chris Marker was trying to say. He talked about a passion for understanding those that we disagree with, those that we don't like, instead of conserving and defending ourselves and denying this kind of contact. So we end with an epitaph for Americans, North Koreans, defying every American expectation and desire that they erase themselves, and Americans refusing to seek an understanding with their very old adversary, still with no passion for understanding. On that point, I'm very proud that a couple of my students, especially Susie Kim, she's done 2 books on North Korea that represent a kind of investigative history. But they stand almost alone because we have so little investigative reporting on North Korea. It's just a crime. I mean, here we are still at war with North Korea. A nuclear war could break out, and we hardly ever get anything but propaganda. The New York Times had a 2-page bunch of photos and some text on the armistice yesterday, and it was all about the North Korean defectors, how they couldn't get a hot shower till they got into South Korea, things like that just always pop up and get nowhere when it comes to understanding what is actually happening in North Korea and between North Korea and South Korea and North Korea and the US. So no passion for understanding, and we remain in denial about a conflict almost 80 years old and within an inch of breaking out again. Thank you. I'll take your questions now.
Could you talk a bit about the sanctions and their impacts on the people?
Well, I don't really know much about the impact of the sanctions on the North Korean people because we get so little reporting on it. I'm sure it's been a fact for decades that poor people with no power, are the ones who suffer most under these sanctions. But I don't have firsthand knowledge or repertorial knowledge of exactly how these sanctions are affecting ordinary people. But the sanctions are just draconian. I mean, North Korea supposedly has not been able to export any coal or import any coal, which is, of course, unfortunately, their main energy source. What is interesting to me is that the North Koreans are doing rather well under extreme sanctions. A friend of mine was in Pyongyang in the last few months, and he was flabbergasted by the building that has been going on. I mean, Pyongyang is always the model city that they throw investment into, and God knows what's going on in the countryside. But I think the practical point, since we're not going to be able to do anything about those poor folks, as long as the sanctions exist, is to have talks to get the sanctions lifted, apart from requiring North Korea to give up its ace in the hole, which are nuclear weapons that deter the U.S. From attacking.
Do you expect George Biden will change his powers for peace?
No.
No.
I was about to say next question. Christine the other day referred to this as strategic patience. And that was also the Obama policy after the so-called Leap Day agreement fell apart in 2016. Here we are, 7 years later, there's been no serious movement toward direct talks. It's not really strategic patience. It's very patient, paying no attention really. But as a strategy, it doesn't work at all. It hasn't worked to bring North Korea to the negotiating table. I don't know what George Biden thinks, but I know that President Obama, I think, just got very tired of the North Koreans. They were so stupid at the beginning of his administration to denounce him as a warmonger and various other epithets, even before he had done anything. And I remember thinking to myself, well, you know, whoever's advising leader of North Korea, that was just profoundly stupid. Why not wait a little while before you call him a warmonger after there's some evidence? And I think he did a lot, you know, with Cuba and other Iran and other so-called pariah states, but I think he just put North Korea on the back burner. I want to say I haven't mentioned anything about Donald Trump, but when I give a talk like this, almost always someone asks me, you know, what about Trump and Kim Jong-un? You know, wasn't that wonderful that they got together in Hanoi and so on? You have to understand that Trump did that so he could be in the Klieg lights of world attention. His every move being photographed and talked about for days on end. He had no intention whatsoever of making a deal with North Korea. And I think it probably hurt Kim Jong-un a lot with his fellow leaders that he came back from Hanoi with nothing and with a very bad snub when Trump didn't even sit around to have lunch with him. But Trump is a complete menace. He's worse now than he was before, which is really saying something. And if the American people elect him, you know, anything could happen. Anything could happen. We could have a dictatorship.
How would you assess within the United States public opinion about the Korean War, or at least knowledge of it? Do you think it's do you think more people are aware and also truly understanding what's going on, or not?
No, fewer people are aware. A long time has passed since the Korean War. It's called the Forgotten War. Korean veterans really gave that name to it, I think, as far back as the 70s. And it became a moniker for the war. But the fact is, it's an unknown war in the United States. It was fought under censorship by Douglas MacArthur and received in the U.S. throughout the McCarthy period. Joe McCarthy was a major figure and a dominant figure throughout the entire Korean War. He didn't meet his end until 1954. And even a liberal journal like the New York Times criticized people for protesting the war. In 1950, Paul Robeson led a protest in Harlem, I think in August of 1950, and the New York Times denounced that protest. You could go to jail, lose your job. I was just talking to one of the people sitting next to me, that I.F. Stone's Hidden History of the Korean War, which is still a very interesting book. He took that to 33 publishers before he finally found a publisher in the early 50s. I mean, it's hard to overestimate the repression in this country during the McCarthy era. You can get a sense of it in the Oppenheimer film, where even the father of the atomic bomb and the most prestigious physicist in the world, Robert Oppenheimer, was himself a victim of McCarthyite red baiting. It's a very dramatic part of the end of the film. So you have a never known war combined with generations going by. And I think the one element of the American public that is very aware of the Korean War is Korean Americans, who are much more numerous than they ever were before. One of the most gratifying things about working on Korea is to see the enormous impact of Korean Americans and Koreans in our culture. Every time I open up the New York Times book review, I think I see another novel by a Korean. woman. And throughout all walks of life, Korean, boy, I'm giving this microphone a hard time. Throughout all walks of professional life, you see Korean Americans. So organizations like Christine has founded and run are very important, but you can tell they mainly appeal to Korean Americans. If I ask the average American a question about the Korean War, I'm going to get back something that couldn't possibly be correct.
I think in kind of building on that idea of a treaty, a simple document says at the end of the war, doesn't attempt to try to resolve the other multitude of issues versus solve all the multitude of issues, and then there'll be a peace treaty. Where you might stand on that. And then the second thing is the argument that many people would give, and it's Congress, I think, against a treaty, that deterrence has kept peace over the 70 years, that would be their argument. And how do you get past that wall, which is a big wall, to try and move towards a peace? So,
Well, I think you're right that there are more important issues than the peace agreement, simply because we have an armistice that has held the peace for 70 years with all its problems. And you're right, the U.S. has deterred a new war in Korea. But the result of that deterrence has been the emergence of North Korea as a major nuclear power. And I don't see that as a success. I do think direct talks that would lead to normalization of relations with the U.S. After 80 years almost would be a good idea. And a peace agreement or treaty. When I keep saying peace agreement, it's because a treaty has to be ratified by the Senate, and it probably wouldn't ratify it. That was hashed out in the late 90s. And I agree with you. It's a kind of secondary or tertiary thing. It's important to get it done, but much more important would be to establish normal relations with North Korea.
they may lead to that.
It could lead to it. I think when you look at the policies that Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun followed, you see what a tragedy it was that Al Gore was not elected. Because he would have continued the Clinton policies, we would have kept a freeze on the plutonium, and you would have had the American president in sync with the Korean president, which is something that started really in 1998 with Clinton and Kim Dae-jung. So the Bush administration has so much to answer for regarding Iraq and North Korea and other things.
I was just curious about your opinions on the role of defense companies and their lobbies, just knowing that they spend, hundreds of millions of dollars, I think about $2.5 billion in the last 2 decades to influence foreign policy. What role that plays.
Well, that's an interesting question. It's almost an archaeological question because the Defense Department budget and the many defense firms that supply it haven't been an issue in this country really since Seymour Melman and a few others passed away, tried to bring it up as an issue. It was a big issue in the 70s. Not an issue anymore. I don't know of a single congressman or woman who protests the $880 billion defense bill that was just before the Congress. $880 billion. And it's just a gravy train for Lockheed and General Dynamics and Boeing. And it no longer gets the inquiry or examination that it used to, except maybe in marginal publications. It's just an accepted fact of American life. And the one thing most people don't understand is the military-industrial complex began with the Korean War, not with World War II. It is an artifact of the enormous quadrupling of defense spending during the Korean War. And it's been a gravy train ever since. I almost, I don't invest in stocks. I used to sometimes. I always shied away from Boeing and General Dynamics on principled grounds. I thought I'd be a rich man if I hadn't done it. I lived in Seattle for 10 years when I was at the University of Washington. And it was Boeing's company town in the 70s and early 80s before it became Microsoft and Nintendo and above all Amazon's company town. The dean of my department or my section in the university admonished me not to criticize Boeing because Boeing was going to give $50,000 to some school. I mean, it's that direct. It's that direct. So I don't know. That's a lousy answer to your question. I wish the answer were that a lot of people are up in arms about the military-industrial complex, but it's just become an accepted fact of American life. Yes.
You say today that the U.S. keeping troops or remaining in South Korea has more to do or less to do with the spread of communism and more to do with where Korea is geographically in terms of the world and maintaining the world. And then kind of connected to that is, given the rising tensions between the United States and China, how do you see that impacting any hope of normalization of United States relationships?
Well, it's a very good question. The problem with our troops in Korea is there's always a new rationale for why we need to keep them there. And for the last decade or so, it's been China. One of the few absolutely true things Xi Jinping has said is when he talked about being roundly contained by American forces in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, or the Indo-Pacific, whatever they call it. The troops now might well be used in a battle over Taiwan, which Koreans don't want. They don't want to be drawn into a war over Taiwan, but got 28,000 troops there, 50,000 in Japan, mostly in Okinawa. And one of the great dangers is that a war over Taiwan would become a general Northeast Asian war. But, you know, the troops are there for that reason and to support the South Korean government. One of the curious things to me after, again, almost 80 years of U.S.-Korean relations is that officials in Washington still speak of South Korea as if it were a child. You know, we can't take our hands off the handlebars. Maybe we can remove the training wheels next, a decade from now. Things like that. That's what they say privately. They don't want Koreans to be alone together. And that's a central part of keeping 28,000 troops there. Now, they're not worth anything in a war. They're worth a little bit, but if a war developed, a ground war, you'd get the troops from Okinawa, you would get enormous numbers of troops from other bases and from the U.S. They're a kind of earnest of our intent to defend South Korea. And they're a major containment point for China to look at. The last part of your question, if we had a general rapprochement with China, then that would encourage U.S. relations with North Korea. One of the things most people don't know is you look back at Kissinger in 1972 when he went, 71, 72, when he went to China. He met with Kim Il-sung in Beijing secretly. And there was talk of unifying Korea at that time. Kissinger later denied this, but Zhou Enlai said that he met with Kim Il-sung. Anyway, don't quote me on that because I don't have any evidence other than what Zhou Enlai has said. But the fact is, my point is, the Korean situation was immediately seen as part of the U.S.-China situation. And the U.S. has played such a huge role in Korea for almost 80 years, as I keep saying, that the U.S. would probably have to be part of any settlement on the Korean Peninsula. But the ultimate goal, it seems to me, and I said this back when I was a graduate student writing my dissertation, what Koreans have said and what they did say back then is Korea exists for the Koreans. It does not exist for Americans. And if Koreans were to take their destiny into their own hands, that might involve asking the U.S. troops to go home. But I think practically and politically speaking, probably the US would be part of any settlement. One of the things I didn't mention is that what American officials say is if we get a peace agreement to replace the armistice, the next thing will be the North Koreans will demand that American troops go home. That's a completely specious argument. They've been demanding that we go home since 1945, and we haven't gone home. We don't have to go home when the North Koreans demand that we go home. So it's a stupid argument, but that's what they say. It's as if it's another domino falling in the direction of North Korean interests.
Bring in the peace in our lifetime. No more forever war. We want peace in our time. No turning away. No turning away. No more forever war. We want peace first today. Bring in the peace in our lifetime. No more forever war. We want peace in our time. No turning away. No turning away. No more forever war. We want peace first today. Separated families scattered across the globe. Policies of hostility taking their toll. Toll on the heart, toll on Mother Earth. We are here now for peace to be first. Bring in the peace in our lifetime. No more forever war. We want peace in our time. No turning away. No turning away. No more forever war. We want peace first